Paul. Hi everybody, good to be here. Thanks to the Community Wetlands Forum for organising the talk. I think it's important just to say at the outset that, you know, if they hadn't organised this talk, you know, I don't know who else would have organised it, and it's a really important conversation to have. So I think, you know, it's a real tribute to this Community Wetlands Forum. I am going to probably say things that are quite obvious to people about carbon offsetting. You know, some things were already said from the floor, some things were said from the earlier panel. So apologies for that, but I don't think there's any harm in sort of repeating things and trying to make things clear. And really the talk is just going to give two examples of carbon offsetting projects related to private finance or conservation finance. One that went very badly wrong, one that went better, and there may be something instructive out of these two examples that we can apply to the Irish context. So before I get into those examples, there's maybe two things that I'll say, which if you don't listen to anything else, at least these things have stuck. So the first thing is that even though the title of this session is Moving Beyond Private Finance, I do think that there is a role for private finance. There's no doubt we need more money for the scale of restoration, not just peatlands, but all sorts of restoration of degraded ecologies, landscapes. But it's very important that the emphasis or the interest in private finance does not become a way to undermine or bypass the need and demand for greater public commitment in peatland restoration. So not just that it stays the same or it reduces because of private finance, but we need to massively increase public commitment. And that's not just finance or funding, that's institutional support, particularly for community-led projects. So that's the first point. The second one is that context matters, and this was made, I think, in the panel earlier and by others. So carbon credits, you know, the whole idea of it is that you can turn very complex ecological processes into an object of value that can be sold and exchanged and transferred. All the literature will say, without any question, it's a very difficult, fraught process. And one of the reasons for that is that context really matters. And that's ecological context, they're different. But for me, I'm a geographer working in environmental governance. It's more the political and social context that matter. And even within Ireland, Connemara, we heard about today, is different to Offaly, it's different to Cork, even within the same, you know, jurisdiction. And if we think about the Irish context, we do not have a very good record of community-led environmental governance. We do not have a very good record of local participation in decision-making. So even though peatland finance and peatland restoration, I would maybe say, is sort of getting more and more attention, the way it evolves or the way it develops is within these contexts that we inherit. And there is a certain inertia there. And so if we want peatland finance to be different, we have to recognize that those institutional constraints, political cultures, have to transform. And that's really difficult. That's much harder than creating a new peatland code or creating various carbon credit initiatives. So if we don't put more energy into that, it will just repeat the same kinds of problems. So that's the second point. You can all turn off now. No, okay, so very quickly, this report, I wrote in 2017, it's a bit of my background. I'm a geographer, worked in environmental governance, environmental politics. So it was published in 2017, National Economic Social Council commissioned it on, basically it's like an overview history of natural capital and payments for ecosystem services and how that relates to conservation finance. You can find the PDF, it still stands up. I was looking through it before the talk. I think the thing that's important about it is that carbon credits, conservation finance, these debates are not new. They've been around for at least 30 years, since the 1990s. So what's happening in the peatland area, and obviously peatlands are very specific. I'm not a specialist in peatlands, but they have their specific characteristics and so on. But these ideas of trying to leverage private finance for conservation of peatlands is not new. And that is why I am going to use two examples, because there's not a lot of examples of carbon offsets and carbon credits in peatland restoration, but there are many examples in forestry conservation, going back to the early 2000s or mid-2000s. So the two examples I'm going to use are around carbon credits, carbon offsets in forest conservation. And so this all begins really in 2005 with RED. So this was the UNEP's project for reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation, which then became RED+. And this was this sort of flagship project, which I think importantly to say was initiated by Costa Rica and Papua New Guinea at the COP11 in Montreal in 2005. So these were two countries with tropical rainforests, extensive tropical rainforests. These rainforests were being cut down for timber and for grazing for agriculture. These were the main sort of economic revenues, the drivers of deforestation. So the idea is, in order to stop this, we need some other streams of revenue to protect the forests. One of the things these forests do is they store carbon. So if the global north, and particularly big emitters, pay us money to keep these in place that is equivalent to or more than cutting them down for timber, for grazing, that's a win-win-win. And so this idea of win-win-win you hear a lot. This is a quote from this really good long-read article from 2015 I give to my students to read. The idea is that you would have money flowing from north to south, you would have climate mitigation, reduced emissions, you would have biodiversity conservation, forestry conservation, and you would have livelihoods, new forest economies. On paper, it looked great. In practice, really difficult. And this article is mostly based in Papua New Guinea, goes into some detail about what this looks like when it hits the ground. And it was already cited today. Kate mentioned it earlier. This, there's been many reports from climate justice activists, scientists, indigenous communities. So a lot of these projects have been in tropical rainforests in the global south that have pointed to the problems with voluntary carbon offsets linked to RED and RED+. But January 2023, there was this report, many of you are probably aware of it, probably one of the most in-depth investigations into the voluntary carbon offsetting market. There's 3 investigative journalist teams. Basically what they found was that Vera is the kind of gold standard of voluntary offsets. So voluntary offsets, for people who don't know, is where companies can voluntarily, that's where the voluntary comes from, offset their emissions. So they're not required to, it's not they're not regulated or it's not enforced, but they can voluntarily offset their emissions by buying carbon credits. So they found that it wasn't just a small number of credits, but 95% or 94% of credits had no benefits to the climate. So it wasn't helping emissions, wasn't helping the forests, was helping the environmental claims of these very big corporations. But I think in the context of this, in terms of communities and community-led, bog restoration and so on, it very much was not helping forest communities, indigenous communities that were living in these places where the projects were taking place. In fact, it was leading to human rights issues. And this is the land grabbing that Kate mentioned too. And the reason for that is, if the forests become valuable because of their carbon storage capacities that can be sold for carbon credits, there will be, if it's not regulated, closely regulated, there will be speculation on that land, there will be grabs of that land, and there will be dispossession. And that happens in those contexts, well reported, but we can also, it's been shown in Scotland, for example, in the Highlands, this is starting to happen with land speculation, where people are not being dispossessed in this type of scale or this spectacularly, but it is having these unintended effects. That's key, it's not intended, nobody wants that to happen, but it's happening. So that's the bad example. We don't want this. And I think one of the key things, when we'll get to the discussion of why it doesn't work, is we think about who designed and led these projects. They were very much led by private intermediaries. So Vera is a non-for-profit, but it is still a private company. And it was done on behalf of or for private companies. There was very little oversight. There was very little regulation in terms of the national governments where these projects happened, and there was very little engagement with local communities who maybe didn't even know that these projects existed. So it's very much done in a way that's not accountable, not transparent, and that makes it vulnerable to these types of abuses. It's not that it's inevitable, and it makes it vulnerable. So, next example, which is a much nicer example, it's more positive, and I give credit to the Climate and Community Project, which is a US non-for-profit. They do great work on all sorts of climate justice issues, do different reports and research, and this was one of the Patrick Bigger, who worked for them, pointing me towards this project. I was asking, where are there good examples of carbon offsetting? There's not a lot, but this is one. At least it's interesting. So, the context of this is California. The Yurok tribe, so historically, their territory expanded for about 500,000 acres. This is in the Pacific Northwest of North America. By the 1990s, this had reduced to about 5,000 acres, so only 1% of their original territory. Very familiar story for native peoples all across the Americas. So in 2010, they benefited from what's called the Californian, get the name right here, the Californian Clean Water State Revolving Fund. It's a bit similar to what Shane had mentioned earlier. Basically what this is that the water utilities in California give loans, could be to any entity, a private entity, or in this case to this tribe, to protect catchments, to protect the land. The Yurok tribe took out this loan to buy 32,000 acres of land, which was 2 catchments. And there was some requirements, they wouldn't use pesticides, or do certain things to protect the water and the land. But they also had to pay back the loan. It was a low interest loan, but they had to pay it back. Initially, they had thought they'd pay it back through sustainable logging, because they bought back these 2 catchments from private timber companies. But that wasn't going to make enough income, and so they needed other sources of revenue. So in 2013, California's cap and trade system was initiated. So this was within the Californian state. It's one of the first carbon markets in the world. System set up where basically there's a state entity, which is called the Californian Air Resources Board, or CARB. They put caps on large emitters. So say, for example, petrochemical refineries. You have to reduce your emissions by this much by this time. One of the ways that they can be facilitated to do that is by offsetting their carbon emissions by buying carbon credits. So we know how that works. So CARB is an important state body that is mediating between the emissions reductions and entities that provide carbon credits, in this case the Yurok tribe. So initially, Yurok tribe couldn't enter into this scheme because it was only for state and federal land, not state and federal land, but this was Yurok tribe land. They pushed very hard to be included. They were included, and they became the first entity to become part of this forest offset program. So up to the present now, they've made enough money from selling carbon credits to buy back 100,000 acres of land. Not only that, but the money has gone into roads, housing, other kinds of social infrastructure. They have developed with the CARB and with the US EPA ways of incorporating their own traditional knowledge, so forest practices, particularly around fire, which is very relevant now to what you're seeing in Canada and the smoke in New York. So this idea of thinning out trees to make forests more resilient. So they have fire officers, the salmon has come back in rivers, so there's all these sorts of benefits that have happened. So this is all the kind of win-win stuff that we want to see. An issue, a big issue, which I think is interesting because it's coming up within the Yurok tribe, is that they recognize that these benefits that are accruing to them in their territory for their people are reliant on pollution happening somewhere else. So there's this idea that they're selling their air so that others can pollute, and others' air is going to be polluted, which is a kind of a very important reflection that they have. And so they know that this is in the future. They don't want to continue doing this. This is not the way that they want to, keep their lands and maybe extend their lands. So that's a discussion that's happening. It's also backed up by, there has been strong, criticisms of the Californian cap and trade market. It hasn't reduced emissions. This came up earlier in the debate. The carbon credits were too cheap initially, so they've been stockpiled, and also, environmental justice issues, where it's still the case that these refineries are creating pollution that mostly affects, communities, people of color, poorer people. So, where does that leave us? I've got a minute to wrap this up. I think the reason why the Europe Tribe scheme worked so well is initially, the obvious thing is they own the land. They own the land. So they own this land, so they have a direct stake in the project. They have an ownership of the project. They benefit directly from the project. They also have strong collaboration, partnership with the state entity, which is CARB, which mediates between emitters and the carbon credit issuers. So it's not private intermediaries. So those are the kind of strong things, and again it brings us to this last point about like a vision for the future, what I think is important. I think it has to begin when we look at that example of the Euro Tribe. They were the initiators. So you cannot imagine having community-led or directed peatland restoration if you don't have strong, well-supported community-based organizations. And that may include things like land ownership. We think about Abbey Leaks bog, there is a lease on a bog. That's a very significant thing that allows certain other things to happen. If it's not land ownership, there has to be very clear benefits accruing to the local community. That's one. The second is the role of the state, which I said at the very beginning, in monitoring, regulating, but also possibly financing. Do we need a new public entity here? Do we need to change the remit of existing semi-states? Do we believe that the semi-states, as they are going to be capable of doing this work? Those are questions that are important. And then finally, this question of carbon offsetting, which isn't going to be resolved today, it's clearly problematic. It's clearly complex. It's prone to exploitation. I think it can work if 1 and 2 are in place. If 1 and 2 are not in place, I would have real concerns about how it will evolve here. So that's it. I just wanted to end with this picture because I really like it. Some of you are in the picture. It's from 2000. But I think a lot of this is going to only happen through struggle. And this picture is from Abbey Leaks, stopping the diggers coming in. And we're here in Abbey Leaks because it's this like amazing flagship project of what community-led peatland restoration looks like. But it began with this. It doesn't just come from on high. It's not a benign thing. It's a really important photo for remembering that. So